Forget the giant turkey legs and roaring fireplaces you see in Hollywood movies. If you walked into an actual English tavern in the 11th century, the smell alone would knock you flat. Here is the gritty, fascinating truth about what people really ate and drank in the Middle Ages, and why it was strictly a matter of survival. To truly understand what was on the menu in 12th century England, we first have to scrap the modern idea of a restaurant or a pub and step directly into the muddy, smoke-filled reality of the medieval alehouse. In the 11th century, right in the brutal aftermath of the Norman conquest, society was strictly divided, and so were its drinking establishments. A true tavern was a high-end business that sold imported, expensive wine, catering almost exclusively to the French-speaking Norman lords, wealthy merchants, and the highest ranks of the clergy. But for the vast majority of the population, the exhausted peasants, serfs, and labourers, the local watering hole was the alehouse. An alehouse wasn't even a purpose-built commercial building. It was usually just a neighbour's cramped, wattle-and-daub crook house. You knew it was open for business when the alewife, the woman of the house who had just finished brewing a fresh, highly perishable batch of drink, shoved an ale stake out her front door. This was a long wooden pole with a bushy evergreen branch tied to the end, signalling to the village that the drink was ready. Stepping inside, you would be immediately hit by a wall of pungent odours. Stale sweat from men who had been ploughing the fields since dawn, the sharp tang of wood smoke from the open central hearth, and the heavy, yeasty smell of boiling grain. The absolute cornerstone of the medieval diet, and the very reason these alehouses existed in the first place, was ale. But this was nothing like the clear, carbonated, golden lagers of today. 12th century ale was essentially liquid bread. It was thick, cloudy, highly caloric, and completely flat. Because untreated river or well water was frequently contaminated with agricultural runoff or human waste, making it incredibly dangerous to drink, absolutely everyone in the village, including toddlers, drank this weak ale from sunrise to sunset just to stay hydrated and energized. Furthermore, hops had not yet been introduced to English brewing. Instead, this early medieval ale was flavored and preserved using gruit, a bitter, localized mixture of herbs and botanicals like yarrow, mugwort, and heather. Because it lacked the preservative qualities of hops, it spoiled within days, meaning brewing was a constant, never-ending and vital chore for the women of the village. When it came to solid food in these alehouses, the absolute, undisputed champion of the working-class diet was a humble dish called pottage. If a tired labourer slapped a hard-earned silver penny onto the rough-hewn wooden table, they were not getting a roasted leg of mutton. Pottage was a thick, endlessly simmering stew or porridge that sat in a large cast iron or clay pot over the hearth fire all day long. Its base was entirely dependent on what the peasants could grow in their meagre village plots. Boiled oats or barley, heavily bulked up with tough, fibrous vegetables like cabbages, leeks, onions, garlic, turnips and peas. The beauty of pottage was its flexibility. If the alewife had a good week, or if a patron brought something to barter, the pot might be enriched with a bit of precious protein to draw in a larger crowd. However, this almost never meant fresh beef or pork, which were privileges largely reserved for the nobility. Instead, the pottage might be flavoured with tough scraps of salted bacon, a bit of dried fish if the village was near the coast, or perhaps some scavenged marrow bones to give the broth some badly needed fat. Accompanying this steaming bowl of pottage was the other non-negotiable dietary staple, bread. Refined white wheat bread, known as manchet, was a luxury that only the rich could afford. The common people ate coarse, dark, and incredibly dense bread known as maslin, baked from a rough mixture of rye, barley, and sometimes ground dried peas or beans. This bread was heavy, hard on the teeth, and packed with fibre. It was so sturdy that it was frequently used as a tool. Peasants would use thick chunks of maslin to scoop up their pottage, soaking up the savoury broth and softening the bread enough to chew. It was a monotonous and aggressively fibrous diet, but it was absolutely essential fuel for a population that spent their entire lives engaged in back-breaking manual labour from the moment the sun rose until it finally set. Once the heavy wooden door of the alehouse swung shut against the biting English chill, you were immediately hit by a wall of sheer, unfiltered humanity. In the 11th century, these cramped, smoke-blackened rooms were much more than just a place to grab a cheap drink. They were the absolute epicenter of village life and the only real sanctuary from the crushing weight of the feudal system. Because peasants had almost zero free time and their own wattle-and-daub huts were dark, freezing and shared with livestock, the alehouse became their living room, their town hall, and their nightly escape. Picture the scene. The air is practically solid with the stinging scent of a central peat or wood fire, the sour tang of spilled ale, and the unwashed bodies of men and women who have spent the last 14 hours hacking at unyielding clay soil. Illumination came only from the flickering hearth and a few sputtering tallow rushlights, cheap candles made by dipping dried reeds into rendered animal fat, which smoked terribly and smelled remarkably like burnt meat. Amidst this sensory assault, the noise was deafening. There was no quiet brooding in a corner. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with locals crowded onto rough-hewn wooden benches, drinking heavily from crude wooden tankards or leather jacks. All flowed constantly, but the alewife also served whatever extra provisions she had managed to scrounge, forage, or preserve to keep her patrons drinking. Alongside the ever-present pottage and rock-hard maslin bread, patrons might be lucky enough to purchase a hunk of green cheese. This wasn't mouldy. In the 12th century, green simply meant fresh and unaged. Hard, aged cheeses were valuable trade commodities reserved for the lords, so the peasants ate the soft, highly perishable curds made from the milk of sheep or goats, heavily salted to keep it from rotting. If a local poacher had risked the severe wrath of the Norman forest laws, which strictly forbade peasants from hunting the king's deer or wild boar under penalty of blinding or mutilation, there might secretly be a tough, stringy rabbit or a few trapped wood pigeons roasting over the flames. Foraging played a massive role in their diet, so the food was often bulked out with wild garlic, nettles, watercress and hazelnuts gathered from the woodland edge. Every single calorie was precious, and absolutely nothing was ever wasted. But the alehouse wasn't just about pure caloric survival. It was the social beating heart of the peasantry. This was where the strict, rigid rules of medieval society slightly loosened their grip. It was a place for roaring, firelit entertainment. Travelling minstrels or storytellers hoping to earn a free bowl of stew might pluck a wooden harp and sing bawdy songs, or recite epic poems of old Anglo-Saxon heroes, providing a rare glimpse of a world beyond their muddy village boundaries. Gambling was rampant and fiercely contested. Men hunched over rough tables playing hazard, a fast-paced and incredibly popular dice game introduced by the Normans, or a strategic board game known as Nine Men's Morris. The stakes were often shockingly high for people who owned next to nothing. A bad roll of the bone dice could easily cost a man his iron sickle, his woolen tunic, or a desperately needed sack of seed grain. Naturally, mixing exhaustion, high-stakes gambling, and gallons of unfiltered ale often led to explosive violence. With no official police force, disputes over a cheated dice roll or a stolen sheep were frequently settled right there on the dirt floor with fists, wooden stools, or the small eating knives that everyone carried on their belts. Yet, despite the occasional bloody brawl, the alehouse was the one place where a 12th century peasant could momentarily forget the crushing taxes, the brutal labour, and the ever-present threat of starvation, finding fleeting warmth and camaraderie at the bottom of a wooden cup. However, the loud, firelit sanctuary of the 12th century alehouse could not last forever, and the end of the night always brought these exhausted villagers crashing back down to their brutal reality. As the evening wore on and the supply of thick, cloudy ale began to run low, the booming laughter, the clattering of bone dice, and the bawdy songs of travelling minstrels slowly faded into a tired, heavy murmur. The absolute endpoint of their fleeting freedom was dictated by the sounding of the village curfew bell. Introduced by the newly entrenched Norman conquerors to prevent both catastrophic accidental fires and secret nighttime rebellions, the couvre-feu literally translated to cover the fire. When that iron bell tolled from the tower of the local stone church, it was a strict legal mandate that all hearths must be dampened down with ash, and all public gatherings must instantly cease. The night watch, if the village was large enough to warrant one, would aggressively patrol for stragglers. Anyone caught wandering the muddy, unpaved lanes after curfew risked being heavily fined by the local sheriff or, much worse, being violently branded as a thief or a dangerous outlaw. So, with bellies completely stuffed full of heavy, oat-based pottage and minds delightfully numbed by gallons of herb-infused Groot ale, the patrons of the alehouse stumbled blindly out into the pitch-black English night. There were no street lamps in the 11th century, only the suffocating, absolute darkness of the medieval countryside, and the distant, terrifying howling of wolves from the dense, heavily regulated forests that surrounded their isolated settlements. They navigated their way back to their freezing wattle-and-daub cruck houses by pure memory and moonlight, their leather boots sinking deep into the foul muck of the unpaved roads. Waiting for them at home was not a soft feather mattress or a quiet private room. They simply crawled back into the exact same lice-infested, straw-stuffed pallets they had abandoned nearly 18 hours earlier, curling up right next to their heavily breathing livestock to siphon off whatever bodily warmth the animals could provide. The massive quantities of ale they had consumed were absolutely vital for their daily hydration and their bare minimum caloric intake. But the drink also served a profound psychological purpose. It was a desperately needed, localized anesthetic. The thick brew helped them to momentarily forget the sharp, gnawing pain of their aching joints and the blistered calluses on their hands. Modern archaeology has shown that their teeth were frequently worn completely flat from chewing the stone grit inevitably mixed into their coarse maslin bread, and their bones bore the heavy, undeniable markers of relentless, lifelong physical strain. They lived in a terrifyingly precarious world where a single poor harvest or a sudden, unexpected frost meant mass starvation for the entire village. Yet, this grueling cycle of endless agricultural labour, incredibly coarse food, and fleeting alehouse escapes forged a population of astonishingly tough, fiercely resilient human beings. These were working-class people who literally built their entire lives out of the mud they stood on. They did not have the imported spices, the heavily salted roasted meats, or the fine French wines of their wealthy Norman overlords, but they had each other. The communal cast-iron pot of simmering, scavenged vegetable stew, the rock-hard loaves of dark bread, and the shared wooden tankards of cloudy ale were the literal glue that held these fragile farming communities together. They shared their meagre, hard-won resources, fiercely protected their neighbours, and somehow found small moments of genuine joy in an era that history often remembers only for its unyielding darkness and immense suffering. When the dawn finally broke just a few short hours later, painting the English sky in pale, freezing shades of grey, the village rooster would crow once again. The brief, desperately needed respite of the night was over. The villagers would pull their aching bodies up from the dirt floor, rub the stinging wood smoke from their eyes, and head straight back out into the freezing mud to start the exact same back-breaking process all over again. They were the unsung, forgotten engine of medieval England, surviving one heavy bowl of pottage and one muddy day at a time.